Hello and welcome to Epochs number 41. This will be part 3 of our deep dive into the origins of World War One. And once again, happily, I'm joined by the superb Apostolic Majesty. AM, how are you?
You do me great honor, sir. I'm very happy to be back. Wonderful to be here.
Great. Well, let's just dive straight in. Last time we got up to roughly 1907, but we might backtrack a little bit just for some details here and there. But I'll let you go. How do you want to carry on?
Well, I thought obviously we ended off last time by talking about why the Russians and the French suddenly came to some sort of understanding with the British. I think it might be a good place to bring this back over to Germany because I briefly mentioned, I'm sure a lot of listeners who were listening right at the end, I mentioned the prospect of a German-Russian alliance in 1904, and many of you no doubt ever heard of that or what the implications of that were. But I think this is a good time to bring us back to the question of Anglo-German relations and how Germany responded to the emergence of this new Entente Cordiale and Triple Entente between 1904 and 1907. So where I really want to start is trying to appraise what the Kaiser's relationship with the Brits was essentially, because it can be interpreted as hostile, amicable, or schizophrenic.
Right, just to quickly say, there are, of course, quite famous images of the king and the Kaiser and the Tsar, because they're all cousins, right?
Mm.
In the pre-war years, going out and enjoying time on the sea together, as if they're friends. Well, they are friends in some level. We've got letters like "Dear Nicky" and things. So it's an interesting thing that the actual interhuman relationships between those monarchs is sort of really quite different to the way their nations viewed each other. That's right, isn't it? Surely.
Well, this is the interesting part because I think George V was a very unassuming and rather dull monarch by comparison to Nicholas II or Kaiser Wilhelm, and exerted virtually nil influence over foreign policy in contrast to his father, Albert Dirty Bertie, as he was often called, Edward VII. But yes, definitely it's an interesting backdrop for what I want to talk about, which is the Biorko Treaty between Willy and Nicky, Wilhelm II, and Nicholas II, who engaged in this correspondence known as the Willy-Nicky letters, roughly 75 telegrams back and forth from around 1900 all the way up until 1914.
That's a
But
lot, actually. That's more than I thought it was. How many was it again, roughly?
75
That's a
roughly.
lot. I didn't think it was that many.
Mm.
Wow. Sorry. Please go on.
And these weren't sort of formal, sort of diplomatic communiques. These were, personal sort of, often the Kaiser offering advice, unsolicited advice to the Tsar, and the Tsar appearing to be very deferential to the advice of the Kaiser. But in terms of what the implications of this were. Obviously, when the Kaiser assumes his period of personal rule after dismissing Bismarck in 1890, one of the dramatic changes that comes about of that is what would appear hostility towards Russia, or Russia interprets it as hostility. And there are some war hawks around the Kaiser who are saying that we should, be on a war footing with Russia. And so very quickly from 1891, the reinsurance treaty is dropped. Russia comes to a new understanding with France, and in 1894 they enter into a secret treaty, the dual alliance between France and Russia. And one of the reasons posited for why the Kaiser took this policy was that he wanted to reorientate Germany away from Russia and towards Britain. He believed that Britain was Germany's natural ally, and so now there had to be a means of contriving Britain, which had traditionally stood out of European continental alliances, to be enticed into the prospect of a German alliance, which may seem rather strange, but nevertheless it was very much what informed the Kaiser's thinking at the beginning. And his novel strategy, which was formed around his Admiral Tirpitz from around 1897 onwards, was the so-called German naval build-up, a massive expansion of Germany's navy to achieve two things. The first thing, obviously, Germany had entered the colonial race late. France, Britain, and in fact all the major colonial powers, even the Netherlands, had a more imposing continental imperial presence than the Germans did. The purpose of this expansion of a blue water navy, so a navy which was consisting of capital ships that could engage in naval theatres all across the world. The intention of this was that whenever there was some sort of scrap, so for example over Morocco, Germany could intervene and say, we're going to put this to a congress or conference. And because of our major naval power, all located around the North Sea, around Bremen, we can therefore turn around and say, because of our naval power, we should get compensation. You should award us this little bit of territory, or that little bit of territory. So that was one aspect of the new naval strategy, which was the Kaiser sort of wanting to transform German policy from European politics to Weltpolitik, world politics. The other aspect of that was that if there was this was Tirpitz's plan, a strong enough German naval presence located in that one area, which could potentially threaten the home country of the British Isles, given that the Royal Navy had commitments all across the globe, that for some reason the prospect of an alliance with Germany would become that more enticing, because remember, before 1904, Britain was not friendly with the French, was not friendly with the Russians, almost got into war with the Russians over the Japanese War, almost got into war with French over the Shoda crisis. So the idea was that if Britain were to ever come into any sort of conflict with France or Russia, Germany could potentially tip the balance by contributing the navy to either one of those powers. So ergo, Britain would have to form an alliance with Germany in order to prevent that happening. That was a rather novel strategy, but that was one that was pursued earnestly.
This feels like, I don't know if I'm way off the mark here, but it feels like Kaiser Wilhelm II trying to play the games that Bismarck played and just not doing it anywhere near as well, or just making sort of the wrong calculation, really. Like, you're going to intimidate someone into being your ally. I mean, there's definitely examples of that, aren't there? Napoleon I, it did that a lot. So it's not completely insane, but it doesn't seem reasonable.
Well, again, this represents sort of the contradiction in Wilhelm's thinking, because on the one hand, one of the first things he says upon embarking upon this new foreign policy was, "We're steering the same course, but full steam ahead," whatever that means. Right. But of course, the difficulty in viewing it in such simplified terms is that Bismarck's foreign policy relied on friendship with Russia. And so this is the radical departure from Bismarck to Wilhelm II, that Wilhelm II believed, no, Germany's future as a world power lay in friendship with Britain, essentially.
Right. One other thing I'd quickly say, so there, of course, in World War I itself, we've got the Battle of Jutland, which is in the North Sea, isn't it? Sort of one of the greatest naval battles, battleship v battleships that there ever were, among them anyway. But this idea that the Kaiser wanted to actually rival the Royal Navy, it's easy enough for us in hindsight just to look back and say, well, that was never going to happen. That was always unrealistic. Or even suggest that the Germans themselves at the time knew it was unrealistic. There's lots of sort of discussion and things around that. What are your feelings about pre-World War I Germany building up its navy? Was it ever was it just to sort of project its power around the world, or do you think they did actually want to, become one of the preeminent naval powers in the whole world? How far down that road would you go?
Well, Germany succeeded by 1914 in becoming the second major naval power, which I'll get into a bit of the details around that a bit later, which is significant considering the extent of France's colonial empire at that time. America hadn't really embarked upon a military buildup at all at this point, anything compared to the European powers. But my understanding of this isn't that the Kaiser wanted to really rival or eclipse Britain in terms of its naval power. I think there was an understanding from all quarters, definitely the Navy, that was impossible. Also, it would be pointless because there was no reason for Germany to have such a massive Navy with so few imperial commitments, unlike Britain. The point was essentially that it had to be a factor taken into account by London when embarking upon its own imperial policy or its own alliance systems. So essentially, it was a tool to be used and conceptualized by the opposition, as novel as that
And
sounds.
it did that, right? It achieved that. Certainly achieved that.
Well, this is sort of, yes, but in all the wrong ways, unfortunately for the Germans. And this is where we'll get back to the Entente Cordiale, because this is also, to my mind, represents a fundamental shift in British foreign policy at the same time. So, as I mentioned, the Entente Cordiale was ushered in under Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne, the Marquis of Lansdowne, who was a member of the Arthur Balfour government, the Conservative government, which also had Lord Salisbury and had been governing Britain since about 1895, and would collapse in 1905, then lose a decisive election to the Liberals in 1906. The effect of Lord Lansdowne's policy is that the Entente Cordiale, as originally envisaged, wasn't hostile to Germany, at least in Lansdowne's mind. It was very much about trying to resolve those differences in the colonial policy of France and Britain when it came to Africa. So specifically, the Entente Cordiale related to two things. One, that France would drop any influence over Egypt, which had been occupied in 1882. France and Britain had been wrangling over control of Egypt for most of the 19th century. So this put to bed one of the major African colonial questions. The quid pro quo of that policy for France was that Britain would do nothing if France were to expand its influence in Morocco, which is obviously where we arrive at the Moroccan crisis. So as originally conceived, the Entente Cordiale was actually quite limited in its aspirations. It wasn't a military alliance. It was a colonial understanding regarding spheres of influence. And this is where we bring in the Kaiser again, because his Russian strategy, his Japanese strategy, and his French and British strategy was inextricably linked. From about the March of 1905, so very quickly after the Entente Cordiale, the French begin to put pressure on the Sultan of Morocco to basically give over, essentially, control of his foreign policy and much of the Moroccan economy to France as part of this agreement. And the Kaiser uses this as the first sort of attempt, really, to enact this policy of the conference system, demanding that because of Germany's new naval power, there has to be some sort of consideration for Germany whenever embarking upon these colonial adventures, so to speak. And it actually works from the beginning. De Classe, the French foreign secretary, resigns when confronted with the German opposition. And really, again, one of the motivations for Germany in pursuing this Moroccan policy was to detach Britain from France rather than become more entangled in France. So rather than attempting to, forcing a strengthening of that alliance, it was meant to detach Britain from France. The thinking from Germany was that if Germany was going to come around and say, well, any expansion of French interests, you need to take German interests in consideration. Therefore, Britain has to become more involved in protecting the French Empire, which will be contrary to its interests of its own imperial preservation. So rather than do that, it would make much more sense for the British to detach themselves from France and become neutral, a neutral arbiter between Germany and France. At the same time, and again, this is why I say that Germany's policy towards Britain is a bit schizophrenic. So that is the key aim there of the Moroccan crisis, you can therefore say, is two things. One, to make Germany a colonial contender. The other is to detach Britain from France. On the other end, the Kaiser is trying to manipulate the Tsar to become more hostile to the British. And this is actually working quite well, because the British are allied to the Japanese and the Russians are at war with the Japanese at this time. So this is 1904 through to 1905. And this sort of culminates around the infamous Kiel Regatta in 1904, when it sort of becomes very apparent that he meets his uncle Edward VII. And he's also, the Kaiser is able to demonstrate the new sort of constructed ships. And it's sort of a very depressing experience for the Kaiser, because at this Kiel Regatta, where he's hosting the King Emperor of the British Empire, it very much comes across to him that the expansion of the Navy hasn't led to the desired effect, which is Britain becoming more amicable towards Germany. But more than that, it appears that the British aren't actually taking the German naval threat very seriously at this point in 1904. So not only are the British not impressed with the pressing into an alliance, but the effort itself was seen as quite pathetic compared to the strength of the British Empire. So in every single respect, the Kaiser feels snubbed. And a year later, we have the exact opposite sort of affair with the Russian emperor, the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. To put this in perspective, he's just been very much humbled by the Japanese. He's in the midst of a revolution in Russia, the 1905 revolution. And all of a sudden, the Kaiser has appealed to him through the Willy-Nicky correspondence as his savior in this situation. And the two meet in Sweden at an island called Björkö near Viborg. The Kaiser goes on his yacht, the Hohenzollern, and the Tsar also uses his own yacht, the Polar Star. And at this meeting, a private meeting between the two, they agree that Russia and Germany will become allied immediately upon the conclusion of the Russian War with Japan. Immediately, so assuming that the Treaty of Portsmouth is going to happen imminently, which of course does end that war, Germany and Russia were supposed to be allies by September. Of course, that never happens. Otherwise, that would have had major implications for foreign policy going forward. Well, what happened to that? Well, the German thinking now, as opposed, and this is why I refer to German policy between 1904 and 1909 as being rather schizophrenic after having been quite Anglophile before. German foreign policy now is essentially embarking upon this radical sort of switch from Britain to Russia, assuming that because France and Russia are allied, that if the Germans and the Russians also allied, that France would have to be therefore forced into an alliance with Germany. That was the thinking from the Kaiser, that this wasn't just an alliance between Russia and Germany. This was an alliance of France, Russia, and Germany, combined with the Triple Alliance, which also included Italy and Austria-Hungary against Britain.
Right.
Talk about a massive diplomatic realignment. And of course, the Tsar agrees to this. He comes back to St. Petersburg and he's dressed down by his foreign secretary, Lambsdorff, who basically tells him that this is all nonsense and basically instructs the Tsar to ignore it and to dutifully abide by the spirit of the dual alliance with France. So here is the Tsar of Russia being dressed down by his foreign secretary, telling him that this is impossible. And the Tsar relents. There's a last-ditched attempt by the Germans to employ the Prime Minister of Russia, Sergei Witte, to come back and act as a counter-influence against the influence of Lambsdorff. Sergei Witte is basically set off under false pretenses that this is some sort of general accord, not a hard alliance, which was what the Kaiser wanted. And when Witte understands this, Witte joins with Lambsdorff in condemning this treaty between Germany and Russia that could have amounted to a major reversal in all the alliances which we've been talking about.
Right. So, but I mean, Nicky was an autocrat, or actually after the 1905 revolution, not exactly, but well, at least before then, he could have had the power just to tell his minister to shut up and go away, and he'll find himself a new minister. Thank you very much.
That was the argument of the Kaiser and the German chancellor. Right. Essentially the Russian foreign ministry was going to the Wilhelmstrasse and saying this treaty was invalid because the Tsar had not consulted his responsible minister. Well, then the Germans simply responded, well, the Tsar is an autocrat, he can do whatever he wanted. Right. But again, I think it sort of shows the weakness of the Tsar at that point, that he was so willing to be contrite before his foreign secretary Lambsdorff and effect this complete U-turn back towards the dual alliance with France, rather than following in the advice of Willy.
It's interesting that Nicholas Romanov there is sort of known, it's sort of quite widely accepted that he's no diplomatic genius, he's no genius of any type, really. The Kaiser is certainly no Bismarck, absolutely not. And, well, the King of England is a figurehead, really. And I've heard it said that even in World War II, different historians have said that the world is sort of run by madmen. I feel like in World War I and just before, it's even more the case. I mean, this is just a tiny bit of an aside before we carry on with the narrative and everything. But what do you think about that? Just broadly, just briefly. The key players they're not like massively enlightened, really, really clever, deep people, are they? They seem to be, well, people like Nicholas and Wilhelm. They're not really the ideal people to be playing games with the world like this.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.